Welcome to Unleashing Liberty. I am Asa J. Thank you for joining us for Unleashing Liberty Live. This is our first episode, and I will pop on out to the chat, give a few little shout-outs. Thank you for joining us. We've got Girls Like Guns Too. What's up, Jen? We've got O1 making the troll threats out there. Please don't hurt them. We've got the Rant and Hick. What do you say, man? J.W. Adderson. What's going on? Glocky Glockerton, what's up? And War Turtleton, thank you for joining us. So what we wanted to do with Unleashing Liberty Live is to provide a more intellectually stringent philosophical framework for liberty. So we're going to be providing the traditional rationale for the accepted pure libertarian position in the tradition of Murray Rothbard, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and then hopefully we're going to get in, if we have time, to some more utilitarian arguments around economics. So we're going to do some brief intros and then we'll get into it. Go ahead, Adam.
Hi, my name is Adam, and I'm a capitalist.
Of course, it is all. Justin?
Yeah, my name's Justin, and I'm a capitalist as well, and I live my life as an agorist.
For sure. Max?
Hi, I'm Max Ann. I've worked with the Libertarian Party for years, and I'm a capitalist also, of course.
And I am Asa J. From PoliceStateDaily.com, CopBlock.org, and the Libertarian Brutalism Network, where you can check out some of these fine folks as well. And I would say I'm an advocate of a private law society. So just to give kind of a rundown on what we're trying to do with this show, part of it is gonna be to try to give people, like I said in the promotion that I made for this show on my personal YouTube channel, a place to discuss ideas that might not be so mainstream, that may be unpopular, over top of this broader philosophical and economic framework we're trying to lay out here. So on the last Sundays of each show, we're going to have open panels. Anyone can join. You white natties are more than welcome to come up in here and talk about the Jews all you want. This is the place to do it. Most of us probably, however, won't be participating in that. I will probably be more. I'll probably be in here, but yeah, I want to give you guys a platform to try to talk about some of this stuff. So the last Sunday of every month, if you would wish to participate in that, check out that open panel. And so these first couple of shows aren't going to be open panel. We're going to take the opportunity to lay out the traditional libertarian position, and then shows will be open panel after this first month, so we can debate and discuss some of these ideas and stuff. So just to get right into it, man. So libertarianism rests on one central principle, right? So this is the axiom or the principle of non-aggression. So no man or group of men may aggress against another person or their property, right? And aggression here is defined as the initiation or the use of physical force or the threat of physical force or violence against a person or property. So aggression is therefore synonymous with invasion, right? And a big misconception among non-libertarians is that we're pacifists, right? But remember, aggression is synonymous with invasion. So defensive force is completely legitimate under the non-aggression principle. So, you know, we see no inconsistency, right, in being what most of you would probably consider leftists on some issues and rightists on others, right? And so it is our summation that the pure libertarian position is really the only consistent one, right? Because it's the only philosophy that's really consistent on behalf of the liberty of every individual. So, you know, we see it illegitimate and an unnecessary and unwarranted use of force to engage in coercion in our economic affairs that a rightist might take offense to, or in our social affairs, like smoking weed or something, man, or getting gay married if you want to, right? So and this position is arrived to really from the recognition of natural rights, right? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of natural rights. Is the cornerstone of most modern political philosophies, and in turn is really embedded in the greater structure of natural law, right? So natural law theory rests on the insight that we live in a world of vast entities, right, with conflicting interests. Everybody has their own unique interest, their own unique self-interest, and each entity has specific properties or a distinct nature, right? So and as human beings, we can investigate these properties with our senses, with our perception, with our mental faculties. So man can think, feel, and evaluate and act only as individuals, right? Only in their immediate self-interest. So it becomes vitally necessary if each man's survival and prosperity, for each man's survival and prosperity, that he be free from aggression to act on his self-interest, to act on his values, to be free to learn, to free to choose, to develop his faculties, and to act upon his knowledge. So this is the necessary path of human nature, and to interfere with it cripples this process. So using violence or state aggression, and we will get in more to what the state is a little bit later, but using violence or coercion goes necessarily against man's natural state, right? Against man's nature for attaining prosperity. So violent interference with man's learning and choices is what Murray Rothbard called profoundly anti-human, as it violates natural law of man's needs. So I'm going to expand on this a little further and then open things up to the panel to talk a little more about this. So the natural rights position is really derived from the claim to the right of self-ownership, right? So the right of self-ownership asserts the absolute right of each man by virtue of his or her being human, by virtue of the fact that he is able to control or be the sole proprietor of his own body without coercive interference, without a higher claim that is made by governments or otherwise to his body. So the right to self-ownership affirms that your body be free of coercive interference. So since each individual must think, learn, value, and choose his or her ends and means in order to survive and flourish, the right of self-ownership gives man the right to perform these vital activities without being hampered and restricted by force. So do you guys have any thoughts on NAP, the non-aggression principle, aggression, natural rights, self-ownership, and perhaps one of you could speak a little bit about positive rights versus negative rights?
Well, the positive versus negative right dichotomy is certainly an interesting thing to look at, because what most people consider rights, especially in America, either fit positive rights or both. There's very few rights listed in American culture that are purely negative in nature, because like a positive right would be, I have the right to take your money, right? That would be saying that's a claim of a positive right, but a negative right would be like, you don't have the right to take my money. It's poorly thought out. Hold on. I had an example in front of me earlier and I lost it. Um, a positive right to life would be that you are required to refrain from killing the person who has that positive right, whereas a negative right would require nothing. Like you just let them live. You don't kill them.
So do you think it's safe to say that the main distinction is essentially a claim of a claim that something must be provided for you versus for you to be free from something?
Yeah, that's pretty much the distinction. The way I usually term it when talking to people is that a positive right is basically saying a claim, and generally it's actually a privilege, not a right, because the way most people define rights anyway is something inalienable, right? That's basically what the Constitution worded it as, and a lot of people latch onto that term, but it very much can be alienated. Like somebody can violate your right to free speech, so then it's not inalienable. That's more of like I see that as more of a principle or like a rule of thumb than an actual right. But to say somebody can say whatever they want and you don't have the right to physically harass them is different. Whereas saying you have protection for saying it is fairly different.
Well, I mean, positive rights are entitlements, right? So when
Yes.
people say they have a right to healthcare or a right to housing or a right to education, those are positive rights. And when people, I mean, they sound nice or whatever, but what people don't think about is to say that you have a right to an education or a right to healthcare. What you're saying, like the other side of the coin, is that other people have an obligation to provide you with that. And most people would say that you have a right to your own life and to decide what you do. And any positive right contradicts this other natural right. So you could argue that there really aren't any positive rights. And natural rights don't require you to do anything. They just require you to not do something. So to not aggress and to not steal or whatever.
Yeah, it certainly simplifies the problem of discussing like what's right when you take away the entitlements or the privileges or anything like that. Because anything that's claimed to be a right, at least in modern society, isn't inalienable. It's not inherent. It's not something that just generally exists because it exists. It's something that they're claiming the government will protect you, or the legal system, or whatever they're saying will protect you. And it's always, of course, subject to like who's in political power at the time if they want to change it.
So do you think it's safe to say that, and I guess Rothbard would say, well, there are no rights really. There's just property. So we don't necessarily have a right to free speech. We own our voice and we own our bodies, and therefore can say whatever the hell we want. But unless we are violating the negative rights of someone else, for example, if we're on their property screaming and shit, right? So all rights are really property rights in the Rothbardian sense. So I think it'd be pertinent to move on and talk about private property and just what exactly that means. So private ownership claims arose out of man's necessity to avoid conflict, right, and live beyond his means. And we're told by leftists, by socialists, invariably that property is violence, that property is unjust. But property, since there's been man, there has been property claims. But so the problem all governments face is how to efficiently allocate resources, right, in a manner consistent with demand. So, and we see this all the time. Eventually, tax consumers outnumber taxpayers, and you add this to decades of bad economic and monetary policy, and the demand for government subsidy becomes too large. So it is at this point history teaches us that governments are forced to begin killing their own citizens in order to make the system work. So, in the eyes of bureaucrats and like high-level apparatchiks, this decision is not perpetrated by anything particularly nefarious. It's simply a matter of practicality. It's for the common good, right? It's for the common good of the great utopian work, and sacrifices must be made, you see. So, as Dr. Hans Hermann Hoppe has pointed out in his essay, The Origins of Private Property in the Family, primitive hunter-gatherer societies face the same problem, right? As populations developed and expanded throughout prehistory, peoples began competing for scarce resources within limited geographic areas. So, being unable to add anything of value to the natural world in the terms of the cultivation or rearing of additional resources, primitive man needed at least 1 square mile of land to sustain 1 or 2 peoples. And you've seen tribal societies begin implementing modern government policies. What are the equivalent of modern government policies? They attempted to limit competition for scarce resources by combating population growth. Policies of forced abortion and infanticide were instituted. But so nonetheless, man lacked at this point in his development the technical know-how to develop an adequate system based on the division of labor and personal ownership required to increase his output. So competing with your neighbors and competing with other people for plants and animals, it becomes troublesome, right? It becomes costly. So it's really in this atmosphere that private property emerged spontaneously out of a primal human desire for peace, right? So we need only look to the existing hunter-gatherer societies of colonial America to see these primitive property rights in action. And contrary to popular belief, Native Americans were not void the idea of ownership of private property. And this may be something we get into a little more on another show. And I may throw an article down in the description box about property rights among the Native Americans. But just to hit on it a bit here, most tribes practice a system of intercollecting collective, family, and individual ownership claims. Now, not only was personal property appropriated from nature respected, like weapons and supplies, but tribes also established and granted water rights, land rights, which were used to preserve fish and wildlife populations. So in these societies, the amount of private ownership usually reflected the scarcity and quality of land. Most farmland was owned, usually by families or clans rather than by individuals, however. But the point I'm making by saying this is that natural scarcity promotes conflict, and this is why private ownership is necessary. Goods that are not scarce are non-rivalrous, right? Competing for the use of air, for example, in the Western world, anyway. There might be a different discussion if you live in Hong Kong, but competing for the use of fresh air, it promotes little conflict because air is so abundant, right? But a resource like oil or whatever natural resource is finite, right? It can become depleted, so therefore it requires ownership, and it's only through the innovation perpetuated by a system of private property that unleashes man's creative productive capacity in a manner consistent with maintaining the objects of his necessity, with maintaining these resources. So if you're worried about the environment, if you want to preserve a scarce resource, have someone own it, right? So it's hard to imagine that domesticated animals could ever become extinct. Property owners wish to preserve their property for future use. So slaughtering all of your chickens this year, that leaves you with no chickens next year, right? So by comparison, it's precisely those animals that have historically had no property owner to rush to their defense whose numbers have been decimated. No, colonial Native American tribes understood this, not really as a result of any special level of discernment, but by simply acting in their own rational self-interest, right? So, and just as an example of some of these rights in animals that the Native Americans had, and then we'll open get a few comments from the panelists and then move on to homesteading. In the Pacific Northwest, Indians had well-defined salmon rights. So to capture salmon returning from the ocean to spawn in freshwater streams, Indians placed fish wheels or weirs, other fixed appliances at falls or shoals where the fish were naturally channeled. So their technology was so efficient they could have depleted the salmon stocks, but they realized the importance of allowing fish to spawn upstream, right? And in the western part of the state, there were some vestiges or some examples of private property in the buffalo. The hunters were entitled to like the choice cuts of meat of their kill and like the furs and stuff of the buffalo and stuff. So this idea that property is just something that spontaneously came out of John Locke's head or something is just absolutely ridiculous, right? So what do you guys think about some of that stuff?
Well, I think that is definitely a very eloquent way to have put it. Certainly, property has always been existed in some way, and as you said, it actually prevented more violence by having private property, especially in primitive cultures, because at least then they had like a defined line. You don't come over my line, and I'm not going to hit you with my club. And then that's how they divided up the resources amongst themselves with as minimal violence as possible, provided the circumstances they were in. Whereas if nobody owned any of the land, like this isn't your hunting ground or my hunting ground, it's everybody's. And you, as you know, I've asked this question of people who proclaim socialism and communism. Like, well, then how do you decide when both of them say I want this, buffalo, and neither one is willing to concede the point? It comes to violence that way. Whereas if there was some semblance of property, they could say, well, this buffalo is mine because it's on my property line at this time. When I got it, I used my labor to capture it and skin it and everything else. And so you can't come over here and hit my head in with a rock and take it. I mean, you can, but it wouldn't be right, and it'd probably be frowned upon by, other people in your tribe and such. There would be an element of retaliation. So, I mean, it solved a lot of these problems. It's obviously not a foolproof system, but I don't think anything is.
Hello.
What's up, Tom?
Hey, how's it going?
Chilling, man. Cooler than a ceiling fan. What do you got to say?
So you're talking about property rights, right?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my view on it is always like it's sort of like the only valid social contract or construct, or sort of put it like that. Like I just see it as an efficient agreement that people come upon to develop a more advanced society and to keep stuff they've built, and that's how technology mainly progresses, through this agreement that you can't take my block, and if I keep my block, maybe I'll make a wheel, maybe I'll make a mill, or and it just grows on from there. That's my view on it. I don't think it's actually it's actually more of a right. Like, some people think it's inherent in people's rights. I don't view it like that. I mean, I support it, but I don't view it like that.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I think the property right thing, especially as you're talking, as you brought up, like with the native tribes and everything, I think that really ties into the next topic, homesteading, because that's how you acquire property. That's how you, especially in the state of nature, you can go out and claim things that are unused. And I don't know if you want to bring in the next topic now, because I'd definitely like to hop in on that one.
Yeah,
Jeffrey,
sure.
Jeffrey, just one more thing. Jeffrey Tucker had a really great speech on it. I'm not necessarily a fan of Jeffrey Tucker, but I'll put it in the chat if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, in the minutes, he sort of explains how property rights is so able to develop like highly technological societies and stuff like that. So.
Cool. But
yeah, and also the need for property rights. The property rights are needed because you know, like in a socialist society, how are you going to distribute these things, distribute property efficiently? You know, there needs to be a system of prices, and there needs to be a market so that things can be distributed to the person who's going to use the property most wisely.
Absolutely, and private property has a tendency to flow in a manner where it's used most efficiently. You know, whoever can best utilize property, whoever can whoever can make resources found in nature more valuable. You know, that's who the property is going to ultimately end up in the hands of, as it's of most use to society. But to move on to homestead, and then we'll get some more. I want to get some more Justin's.
I mean, just really quick, to expand on the point on how property goes to the people who can make the best use of it. Property usually goes to the highest bidder, and the reason why the highest bidder is bidding so much is because he's going to be able to make a profit. And if he's going to be able to make a profit,
it goes to the
he's gonna he's gonna distribute that property more efficiently. And the way you know that is because he's making a profit, because more people are demanding it, and so on. So it takes care of itself. Yeah.
So Rothbard would say that property is a moral right or a natural right, and justifiably follows from the principle of self-ownership, as we spoke about a little earlier. But so to have bodily integrity really means to be the exclusive controller of your own life, right? The sole proprietor of your life, the exclusive controller of your body, and to pursue actions congruent with your own mind, right? With your own conscience, without interference from governments or otherwise, right? So long as doing so does not interfere with other persons or property. So self-ownership affirms the ability of man, like we were saying, to conform the natural world to his will, right? To regulate one's own mind means rationally utilizing his productive capacities to appropriate and cultivate previously unowned resources from nature in order to improve his standing. So inasmuch as man is the sole proprietor of his own body and controls its usage thereof, his labor that descends from his body is thereby also his. So by mixing one's labor with previously unappropriated resources or resources found in nature that have no other substantive claim over them, that product becomes your property as well. And this is the Lockean view, the neo-Lockean view of how property is attained, right? Through the act of first use or original appropriation. And this is called the homestead principle, right? So I've got a quote here from John Locke out of his seminal works, the Second Treatise of Government, which the homestead principle, as relayed by Murray Rothbard and others, were expounded upon. But Locke says that though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. So this nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and his work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature, hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So the homestead principle is important because, as Justin pointed out, taking without private property, property rights are arbitrary, right? They're vulnerable because, as predictably, some central authority will try to assign property claims based on political interest. Right? I should rephrase that. Why the homestead principle is important, or the act of original appropriation in acquiring property is important, is because, absent this principle, property is going to be assigned by some outside entity. And it's also important to consider that taking first possession of a thing means that no tort exists, right? So in this case, theft or trespass against someone else. But yeah, I'll kind of stop there, and perhaps we can get.
Yeah, I don't agree with the homestead principle, actually. Like, I'm 100% ANCAP, but I don't actually think it's valid. I mean, like you pointed out, it's first come, first served. It's not necessarily who's capable. You know, it's good in a way that it will allow people to develop their land, and it gives them an incentive to, you know, not like build a farm and then destroy it and then go off, build another farm, etc. But there is the Aristotelian, I would call it more of a neo-reactionary position, which is basically the only property you own is the property that you can defend. So when it comes to self-ownership, the Aristotelian position would say, you know, slaves don't truly own themselves because they haven't been able to defend themselves. When someone's property is taken, it's not. I mean, they have obviously a moral incentive that it should be theirs, but they don't truly own it. They can't truly defend it. They can't truly use it. So that's the Aristotelian position.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, though. Like, you can say they have a normative right to
No, there's definitely overlap. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can say they have a normative right to property and so on, but like in the real world, it just happens that they cannot make use of that right. So yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
I mean, certainly both, you know, require a level of protection. You have to protect your property, and I mean that's where I get to property from myself. But like, that's not the traditional Rothbardian position or anything. But you have to be able to defend what is your, well, it kind of is. You have to be able to defend what it is, whether you know, stand there on the property yourself, put up a big ass fence, hire a bunch of guys with guns, whatever, because, you know, if you can't protect it, somebody else can come and take it. That's just natural law, essentially.
Yeah, like even if you're like full Rothbardian, like you're gonna have to take action at some point. Like saying that you have a right is not enough.
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously.
Yeah, force is definitely required for defense, self-defense.
Yeah, and that's just practical. I mean, you can't expect to still own your wallet if you leave it out on the sidewalk somewhere. You know, I'm sorry, but you don't have the ownership of that anymore if you're not able to keep it in your pocket and defend anybody else from taking it. And that kind of ties in with absentee ownership. You know, how much land can one person own? Well, pretty much whatever they control without somebody else coming in and homesteading it. You know.
Perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about your homestead, Justin.
I mean, I got the YouTube channel 420 Homestead. You know, I wish maybe one day I will be able to actually go out on some unused land and homestead it. But for right now, you know, I bought a piece of property, and like I said in the beginning of the chat, I just live my life as an agorist for the last year, growing my own food, you know, raising animals and stuff like that. As well as hunting, and then also acquiring things from nature. You know, I'm surrounded by, I guess, what you'd call public land, and I go out there and I obtain unused resources. And, awesome. You know, my purpose behind all that is, you know, I guess in the grand scheme of things is ending the state, but I just couldn't stand, you know, working for the man anymore and paying taxes and all that stuff. And as far as I can figure out, growing your own food and vegetables is the only way to avoid paying taxes nowadays.
Good job, man.
High five. Yeah, so I guess now, if anyone else don't have anything to say about homesteading or property rights, we'll move on to the state, the dreaded state. And lay out, well, I'll just get into it. So the traditional definition of the state is really comes from, or at least in the libertarian tradition anyway, comes from the sociologist Max Weber, right? Who in his essay Politics as a Vocation defined the state as the, quote, legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, and thus said that the modern state is a compulsory association which organizes domination. So in other words, Weber describes the state as an organization that succeeds in holding the exclusive right to use, to threaten or authorize physical force against residents of its territory. So I would submit, and as many libertarians have, and to tweak Weber's definition, I would reword things to say the state should be defined as the legitimized, right? The legitimized, not legitimate monopoly on the use of force. So the state is almost universally seen as an institution of social service. And there's a great work by Rothbard that's been linked up in the description box called Anatomy of the State. And I'll get into some of those central arguments now. But for your homework, you should check that out if you're unfamiliar with it. So, yeah, with the rise of modern democracy, the concept of the state has really became synonymous with society. Society and the state, people can no longer really differentiate between the two, right? But because the state is seen as you know, a great protector and an institution of social service, like I said. So, you know, and this is what we're taught from the beginning in all the government schools, that we are the government, right? That the state is really just an expression of our will, you know, carried out by these selfless politicians, right? Who are just working to just trying to help us out, right? So.
Oh, do not go to the UK. Because the state has this effect, right, where it's like everything they provide, if you're against the state, you're against what they provide, right? So if you're against police forces, people think you're against protection in general. It's bullshit, right?
It's very much the same here, I have to say.
Yeah, but in the UK, right, because the government provides healthcare, when you say you're against the government and you're against, like, you want to literally abolish the government, people would take it as like this death threat. And it's like, if you get cancer, I want you to fucking... It's so bizarre. I can't even explain it. They take it as a literal death threat. That's it. That's all that's on their faces when you say, I want to abolish government.
Well, you'll see a lot of that here too, I would definitely say, especially up where I'm at in the Northeast. I mean, we take a lot of cues from what England and the UK are doing. So there's certainly a lot of it's a liberal stronghold, I'll say that. And when I say things like even simple things like the mass Libertarian Party right now is trying to advocate, you know, lowering taxes. And I'm like, well, I would just get rid of taxes in general. And then they look at you like you're the devil and trying to kill everybody or something.
Yeah, it's the same psychology as like if you were to tell a 3-year-old you were going to take her mother away.
Yeah.
You know, but she provides everything for me. What are you talking about? You can't take her away from me.
And I'm sure we've all heard it on the education, right? Even conservatives, if you say, well, the government, you know, there should be no public education. What? You want children not to be educated? My God! You know. And
no,
so,
I do want them to be educated. That's why I don't want the government doing it.
So in that sense, like, property is very liberating, right? So if the state has the power to give you everything, it has the power to take everything away from you, right? So if you own something, if you have capital and savings, and you own what you have, then it cannot be taken away. So, like, it's very comforting to think, like, oh, I have all this stuff guaranteed by the state, but you cannot, like, it can also take it away, right? So it's very risky. It's like giving up liberty and sovereignty for security and so on. So it's a trade-off, right? So the other kind of property is responsibility and so on. And so yeah, people don't like responsibility.
Yeah. Most people are net beneficiaries of the system, as as our good friend KK, who I physically removed earlier, would like to say. But to get back to Rothbard's arguments.
What did he do? I'm interested.
Yeah, don't worry about
Okay, okay.
it. I'm just joking around anyway. But so yeah, the state blurs the lines between civilization and itself, right? And civilization always precedes the state. The state plays catch up. You know, it's only after something is created by the market or there's some legitimate concern that grows out of society that the state acts. And as Justin mentioned earlier, this is due in large part because of it can't calculate, right? It's unable to properly discern if what it's involved in is of overall value. But
yeah, there's no price mechanism.
For sure. but to get back to Rothbard's arguments in Anatomy of the State, so yeah, they use this collective we, right? We the people. It's even in the Constitution, right? We the people came together to form this more perfect union, right? But so this has enabled an ideological camouflage to be thrown over the reality of political life, which is one of coercion. So Rothbard says, if we are the government, then anything a government does to an individual is not only just and untyrannical, but also voluntary on the part of the individual concerned. So if the government has incurred a huge public debt, which must be paid by taxing one group for the benefit of another, or the government conscripts a man or throws him into jail or something, well, they're really just doing that. We're really just doing this to ourselves, right? And so by this reasoning, like the 250 million people murdered by their own governments in the 20th century alone, they weren't murdered, really. Instead, well, they must have really committed suicide, right? Because, well, they were the government. So, this was one of the arguments Rothbard made that made me start questioning things in the early days. But he goes on to say that we must therefore emphasize we are not the government, right? So, and the government is not us. And the government does not in any accurate sense represent the majority of people. This serves true for any government, be it autocratic, republican, democratic. Power does not represent you, right? Power will never represent you. And we often hear, the two wolves and a sheep voting for what's for dinner, the tyranny of the majority. But it's not even a majority in modern democratic systems. For example, like in the last presidential election, I think something like, and my stats may be off here, but you'll get the general gist of what I'm saying, the underlying principle. But so we had like 50% of voters that voted. So that's like such a small percentage of the population that is engaged in the democratic process. So it's not a tyranny of a majority, it's a tyranny of a minority. We have an extremely small group of people dictating not only through the coercive measures of politicians, but participating in the process. So it's a fallacy to say a democratic system is a tyranny of the majority. But
so you're saying we need a law to force everybody to vote?
Mandatory voting, man. Yeah. At gunpoint.
Yeah, but
something to be said about some people might think like, oh, but you need a state to enforce property rights, but that cannot be true, because property must necessarily precede the state, because the state feeds on property. If there wasn't property to begin with, it wouldn't have had anything to leech off of. And the thing about, so it's like 40% of the people who vote, and even if it was
same thing.
Yeah. So but even if it was 100% of people who voted, democracy or the majority will does not make something moral, right?
It's not
On the
even
face of it,
majority.
yeah. So if you're with 5 friends in a restaurant, and they have a vote to okay, so who's gonna pay for the bill, right? And 4 of them say that you have to pay for it. I mean, is that legitimate? Obviously not, right? So it's the same with democracy. And another thing, though, is that the state is inherently antisocial and decivilizing, right? Because there are two ways in which you can get sort of resources, right? Sort of the voluntary way or the private property way, which is, you have resources and you voluntarily exchange them and so on. Or the state way, or the antisocial way, which is you can wait for somebody else to do that, and then you like extort them or whatever. So so the state has nothing to do with being social or being peaceful or providing like a framework in which property rights can work. It's just a leech. It's
Yeah, going back to the earlier point, I just watched a video where it sort of visualized the study that was done, and it basically said that the least popular policies had a 30% chance of getting legitimized, basically, or legislated. While the most popular policies also had a 30% chance of getting legitimized. So, I mean, everyone has this idea that their vote, doesn't really count, and it fucking doesn't. There's some like empirical evidence on the side that your vote does not matter at all when it comes to policies that you want to get passed.
Yeah, so this is the rational ignorance, right? So the cost of being an informed voter doesn't justify the benefit of voting, because just your one vote is the benefit of doing that, of being informed, and all that opportunity cost doesn't justify what you're getting out of your vote, which is for you individually, it's basically nothing, and especially when you consider how unlikely it is that your vote is going to make the difference. So yeah, you can be irrational, and so what happens is that people vote on the basis of feelings and sort of like crowd mentality, and or they vote like negatively, right? Like, oh, I don't like the other guy, and so on. So yeah, and more than that, though, I think it's probably important to hammer on the incentive problems, right? So if a public or a state enterprise, like say for example a school, if they have like a low score, or they're like not enough kids are graduating, what happens is that they get more money and more funding. Whereas if that happens in the private market, what happens is that they go broke. So it's not just that the incentives aren't there, it's that the incentives are backwards. So the police force, right, if they're doing a bad job, they don't go broke, they get more funding. So the state corrupts everything. And yeah, state is bad.
Yeah, it is only in government where your repeated failures result in larger and larger budgets. And so if the state is not a progenitor of all that is good in the world, and a protector, and is, what is it, right? So Rothbard goes on to say that, expanding on the Weber definition, that the state is an organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. So in particular, it's the only organization in society, as Adam was saying, and to reiterate that point, that obtains its revenue not by voluntary contribution or payment for its services rendered, but by coercion. So while other individuals or institutions obtain their income by actual production of goods and services, and by peaceful voluntary exchange through sale and contract, the state obtains its revenue exclusively by the use of compulsion, right? That is by the threat or the use of.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So governments always, they pander to the lowest common denominator, right? They're like, think of the average person, half of them are stupider than that, right? So what tends to happen is government always goes towards redistribution of wealth towards, more incompetent people, which obviously, because it's the lowest common denominator, it has an overall effect on everyone, and it brings everyone down. It's not. People act like it's bringing humanity up and funding space programs and shit like that, but on average, the net loss is massive. While the net profit is like, maybe a big company might get easy regulation over another company or something like that.
Yeah, so another thing to be said about that is that if you have a state, if it can be bought, it's gonna be bought and sold, right? So congressmen, like, even though they're not nominally for sale, congressmen are for sale, and you can just buy them. And so it's really fallacious to say that, oh, the government is us and so on.
Yeah, yeah. And in the UK, there's a study done where it found that most people would decide who to vote for in the final 2 weeks of the election, or of the run-up to the election. So, a lot of research. I'm sure we've done that.
And I mean, it's vastly inefficient. Like in opposition to the state, man flourishes, right? Through the process of voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange, productivity soars. Living standards of all participants increase enormously, and and I'm reading some of this out of Anatomy of the State, which again is your homework and will be in the description box for those who are not aware. But Rothbard goes on to say that the only natural course for man to survive and attain wealth is through this process, right? Through the production and exchange process. He does this first by finding natural resources, as we've outlined before, and then by transforming them, mixing his labor with them, as Locke put it, to make them his individual property. Then by exchanging his property for the similarly obtained property of others. So this social path is dictated by the requirements of man's nature, right? And is therefore a path to property rights and a free market of gift and exchange of such rights via contract. But as Adam was pointed out earlier, yeah, the German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer pointed out that there are two mutually exclusive ways for acquiring wealth. So one, the way I just mentioned.
I think you should premise this. Can I give a premise?
I'm sorry, what?
Sorry to interrupt. A premise, so like the inherent premise that people should understand, because when I didn't understand it, I was sort of in between arguments a lot. So a fundamental thing to understand about the market is that when someone makes any exchange, they profit, right? Even if you're trading money, they profit, because say if I go to McDonald's, I want the burger more than I want the £2 or $2, and they want the money more than the burger, right? So wealth is generated from that simple exchange, and that happens billions of times a day, all day. This is why voluntary exchange is so much more efficient and so much better than force. This is why we advocate voluntary exchange.
Yeah. So the market is win-win, whereas the state, if you have to force something, then it's inherently win-lose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
even if you look at the state from a perspective of that it actually works to whatever degree, I often compare it to mechanics, cars, computers, whatever. You have a lot of moving parts in a state, especially the size of like a federal government like the US or the UK. And even if they're working in their prime, like when you take that car off the showroom floor, everything works great, right? But over time, something's going to fail. And you'll have to replace that part or, fix it up or whatever you have to do. And the more parts you put into it, the more opportunity for those things to go wrong, and it eventually becomes such an expensive and exhaustive process of just swapping out a part, swapping out. This is why we don't have cars. Very few people have the technical ability to have a car from the 40s and keep it running today. And the parts become so expensive and everything. And the state's much like that, in that if it were to run like on the showroom floor, that would be great. But that's not what we have now. We have a beater. We have a piece of shit car with all the different parts being swapped out every other week, and it's breaking down on the side of the road. We have to get a jump truck out there and call AAA, and they're not helping. I mean, that's my analogy of the state.
And just
do you want to go
really
back
quick
to
before.
Franz Oppenheimer? Because I interrupted.
Yeah, no, just really quick before you go back to Franz Oppenheimer, another example of how the state is antisocial and not a promoter of peace and understanding is that in, say, for example, the U.S. is 300 million people, but these 300 million people have different incentives and they have different wants and needs. So what you're gonna get is like for example, the bureaucrats are gonna vote themselves money, and the poor people are gonna vote themselves money, and the rich people are gonna vote themselves exceptions, and like I don't know, like let's say Asians are gonna vote themselves sort of Asian-friendly regulation and so on. So it puts everyone against everyone, and this is in contrast to the market where they would all have to find mutually beneficial solutions, right? Because they wouldn't be able to force them on one another, so they would both have to agree. Whereas if you have a government, then it's only one person wins over all the others. Whereas if this decision were taken in the market, they would have to necessarily reach a voluntary solution with which they are all happy. Whereas if you have a government, only one solution that one of the parties wants is reached. So yeah, so that's antisocial and that doesn't promote peace, and that puts people against one another. And it's not organic. It's not normal to have completely different people voting on the same thing because they disagree, right? Obviously, so someone's gonna be unhappy. So yeah.
Yeah, continue with Franz Oppenheimer.
Yeah, well, it's contrary to natural law, right? It's parasitic, you know. And instead of adding production, the state only subtracts from it. Yeah, Oppenheimer, as Adam pointed out, distinguished between the political and economic means. That there are two mutually exclusive ways of acquiring wealth. One is, you know, the process we've been describing, the process of production and exchange. Involuntary association, right? This is the economic means, the voluntary means. So the other is simpler, that it doesn't require productivity. It's seizure of another's goods or services by the use of force or violence. And you know, this one-sided confiscation, theft, right? Theft. Everything the state engages in is theft, because it can produce nothing for itself. So this method, right, through conscription and compulsion, Oppenheimer termed the political means to wealth. So you got the political means versus the economic or the voluntary means. So it should be clear that the peaceful use of reason and energy in production is the natural path for man. Like I said, the state is contrary to natural law, right? The exploitive political means is contrary to the natural evolutionary state of man, which is to what's the word I'm looking for here? To cooperate, yeah, which is to cooperate. So the political means siphons production off to a parasitic and destructive individual or group. And this siphoning not only subtracts from the number producing, as you'll see in any country who, you know, has extremely high taxes. You're going to get the producers are going to flee the country anyway, right? So, but it also lowers producers' incentive to produce, as I said, beyond his own subsistence, because in the long run, the state eventually destroys its own supply, right? And we see this with every socialist government throughout history, right? What was it Margaret Thatcher said, that, you know, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. And so it is only because of a free market system that a Leviathan state can exist at all, you know, as someone said earlier. But eventually, this, you know, this subsistence and predation, it can only last so long, right? And they can try to inflate their way out of it. They can try to engage in wars, like we're currently seeing Venezuela attempt to do, as their economy completely fails. And I'm getting told on Reddit by socialists to not believe the conservative propaganda about Venezuela, man, you know, and all this shit. And so it's fundamentally unsustainable anyway. So what is the state? the state, in the words of Oppenheimer, is the organization of the political means, right? This is the institutionalization of theft, of predation. It's the systemization of the predatory process over a given territory. So, you know, crime at best is sporadic and uncertain. But the state you can count on, right? And you know, it provides a legal and systematic channel for the predation of private property that in any other case would be seen as a damnable crime if perpetrated by a private citizen, right? The state can mass murder and call it war. It can steal all your shit and call it taxation. And I can't remember what thinker, what libertarian thinker said it, but a good way to evaluate the state is could a private citizen do what the state is doing? And if the answer is no, and the answer is that it's illegitimate for a private citizen to do it, it is illegitimate for the state to do it. The state does not simply transcend your values, right? And this is what the state does, as previously mentioned. It blurs the lines of ethics. It blurs the lines between society and itself. But since production must always precede predation, the free market is anterior to the state, as we said. And you know, this is a really important point and something that we'll get into more on episode 2 when we dive into the Constitution. Really want to dive into the Constitution on next week. But the state has never been created by a social contract. It has always been born in conquest and exploitation. And you know, the classic paradigm was a conquering tribe pausing in its time-honored method of looting and murdering to conquer a tribe, to realize that, you know, this would be more efficient and a more pleasant situation if the conquered tribe, or rather the conquering tribe, just lived among the populace and extracted a tribute. Right? This is how the modern state developed. Right? Raiders would come in every year, twice a year, whatever. There would be wars and shit. This was unsustainable, right? This was costly. So what do? No, you live among the population. You give the population positions of some relative status, and you are able to extract wealth for them while, you know, providing some minute social services that you know, they think they owe you for, or are even thankful for. And you know, after one generation of this, you know, everybody forgets that who the barbarians really were, right?
Well,
So,
yeah, certainly you're referring to Rome there, right? And like they mastered that in the early days of the empire, where they would go in and, you know, you pay Caesar your tribute, and we build these nice little roads for you, and make you a Roman citizen or whatever. But you even find in Rome, like, Rome fell because it just expanded too far beyond its means, and it wasn't cost effective for them to send, you know, Roman legions out to defend Gaul or the Celtic lands or, you know, Britain. And eventually it was just so consuming on their resources that, you know, a couple of leftover barbarians from Gaul just stormed the gates and took the place down. It wasn't even difficult, you know, because that goes.
The reason is because the state lives off the citizens' production. So in the beginning, when you have a relatively small state, the general policies are a lot of economic freedom because the state doesn't have the ability to restrict it. When it grows, because it leeches off this massive production or this massive wealth generation of citizens, it eventually grows so big that it starts limiting economic freedom because it wants to expand its monopoly, right? And eventually, like with every state, even today in America and Russia, you see, like, you know, what was once a small government grow into a massive government that can barely, you know, hold its own legs. So
Yeah. So like even the smallest state has within it the seed of its sort of becoming gigantic, right? So because if you start with like the smallest state possible, then people are going to be very productive. But bureaucrats still have their incentive, and if people are very productive and have a lot of wealth, then the amount of money that you can tax keeps growing and growing, and the incentive to tax it also grows. And so so like even if you start with like the smallest state possible, which is what happened with America, then you're going to end up with a gigantic state because the incentive is there to tax all the wealth that is being produced because the state is small at first. So that's why minarchism, it's sort of doomed to failure because
Britain is a great
there's
example
no
of that.
mechanism to limit it. Like there's no way to make the state not grow.
Yeah,
And
the
Right.
UK is a
pieces
great example
of
of that.
paper don't work because the state controls the piece of paper. It's
Well,
like
I mean, the inevitable outcome of that is going to be, well, if we want to have a state like, the American state was founded, then we have to have a bloody revolution every couple hundred years. I mean, even the founders said that.
yeah,
you
but that's
know.
stupid, right? Yeah.
It is stupid, but that's
Yeah.
that's basically how the system was designed. You had Thomas Jefferson saying, the tree of liberty needs to be watered by the blood of tyrants. He understood that this
Well,
was
yeah,
going
I
to
mean,
happen.
like, look at their writings, like Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams. They all opposed taxation, but because Washington had so many connections, had so many, rich connections and generals and stuff like that, they couldn't oppose it. Like they had to sign it, like for the
Yeah.
not
So
sure if it was
it's
the
like
Declaration. It was like an article of Congress,
it's like
and most of them opposed it.
locking in a criminal with the key, right? And just like hoping
Yeah.
like, oh, don't use the key. Like it's really silly. Or if you want to use the example of the Constitution, it's like, okay, so here's this paper, and this paper says that you cannot do those things, and by the way, you can change the paper. It's ridiculous, right? And I mean, for all intents and purposes, like the experiment has been run, right? So the U.S. Constitution is pretty good and so on. We've had them for centuries, and look where we are now, right? So it failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, Samuel Adams said that how can there be liberty if property can be taken without consent? Anyway, go on.
Yeah, I didn't really want to get in the Constitution, but let's do it, man. That looks like where we're going anyway. We can save the more
Do you
utilitarian.
guys know about Washington and how he met?
Quit interrupting me, fuckface.
Sorry.
I'm just playing, by the way. But yeah, we can wait till I got this big damn child in my mouth now. I sound like a real redneck, but probably got backer all over my face too. But yeah, we can wait till till next week to go over some of the more utilitarian economic arguments. Going over monopoly and competition and the socialist calculation problem and things like that. But yeah, let's get into the Constitution. Go ahead, Thomas. Go.
Oh, me. I was just gonna say, do you guys know about how Washington sort of rose to power and how he like massacred French guards like that weren't attacking and shit like that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with a lot of it. I'm not
Okay.
exactly a stand-up guy.
Yeah, so I mean, generally people think of Washington as like this sort of innocent rebel, and in reality, he was a well-connected landowner, and the only reason he got in the positions he did was because, basically, because of family and relatives, and he was just generally a bloodthirsty sort of. I don't want to say dictator-ish, but he was kind of like that. He wanted the power and the blood and all this. There's a bit where he writes in his, I'm not sure what they are, like memos or whatever, and he sort of admits this thing that he denied to the British, where he went and massacred French guards for no reason. Like, he just goes and sacrifices a bunch of men just to kill French guards that weren't attacking during a peace treaty. So he denies it all this way, and then at the end he just writes, yeah, massacred a bunch of French guards, like, lol. You know.
Well, I mean, it speaks to the common problem with a constitutional system or any other kind of state. You know, you can premise it on democracy or constitutional republic. Well, what you always end up having is there is a particular kind of person who's going to gravitate towards those positions of power. And there's a lot of P's in that, so it was difficult to say. But the fact is that these individuals are gravitating towards that type of position. And yeah, maybe some of them are going to have, you know, a good position that they're coming from. But how do you separate that out from the guy who's like, well, I just want to get everything I can, or I want to, you know, take bribes from, you know, this big corporation or this special interest group? Those people are inevitably going to be the ones running for those roles in government and putting on the brave face and telling you it's all about how much they love the children. And so any system premised on that is going to attract at least a portion of the people who get those positions who are going to be leeches and psychopaths. And it's just the nature of the beast, so to speak.
Yeah. So the last people who should have power are the people who seek it, right? And democracy basically like systematizes the worst people to have power to like empowering them.
So an objection I often get from constitutionalists is, well, we just gotta enforce the Constitution. The problem is the people aren't enforcing it. So if we can just mobilize the people and get them to enforce it, that things will be different. So what's the problem with that position?
Yeah, so the people are not the state, right? Obviously. The state has bureaucrats, and bureaucrats have their own incentives. And they have no incentive to enforce the Constitution. Like, at all. Like, their livelihood depends on them not enforcing the Constitution. So, I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, there's an incentive problem, right? There's a lack of personal incentive that exists in private citizens in pursuing public affairs. You know, constitutions or constitutional systems notwithstanding, and are vastly less superior at securing liberty than private contracts, you know, enforced in a private law society, where citizens actually have a direct incentive to ensure that the terms of their contract are fulfilled and have, you know, written in means of reprisal and arbitration for when the duties are not fulfilled to them. And
yeah. So the state has no accountability. Like, if the state fails to provide on its end of the contract, which is like in the air as to what that is, it's not going to enforce itself, right? Because it doesn't have an incentive to force itself to that contract. It's like when a cop gets in a trial, that's the judges judge. I mean, it's the watchers judging the watchers, right? So they're obviously biased, and they're biased to the point that it's literally their livelihood that's at stake, right? So it's not just that they don't feel like it; it's that they cannot, because, I mean, it's their job. Their job is at stake.
Well, you know, and you add to that fact, like, the people don't have as much stake in it, and there's, you know, all these different forms of propaganda that have been, like, honed to a fine point by, you know, the Nazis. You know, obviously, Himmler was pretty on point with his diagnosis of how to propagandize people, regardless of what he was propagandizing for. The Soviets, I mean, they have volumes upon volumes of books dedicated specifically to targeting the lowest common denominator or a perceived oppressed group and telling them, hey, you know, it's all capitalism's fault. It's all your constitution's fault. And, you know, incentivizing them to vote for a larger state. So if they do get involved, you have to hope that they're not influenced by propaganda from an outside source or an opposing viewpoint. And it's like I said before about the car. Like, there's just so many moving parts that it's inevitably going to break down on the side of the road.
Yeah, and there's also this weird psychological effect in humans where it's like, I think Stalin once said, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. So, I mean, we even see this now with like fucking sea silver lighting or whatever. Like everyone's going crazy over that, but massive tragedies like the state, like, so yeah, like, you know, all that shit that's going on. But they're just like, yeah, whatever, like it happens.
Yeah, and what we hear a lot, and what I even hear a lot from even people who consider themselves rightists, they'll make the socialist, the liberal social contract argument. And, you know, this is the biggest misconception of the American system is, you know, that the United States Constitution or constitutions form some kind of binding contractual legal agreement between citizens and the government, right? Because after all, it says we the people, you know, again. And but who are these people, right? Certainly those of us who are not even born, you know, when the document was foisted upon the American people have little or no obligation to it. And, you know, this is the difference between a legitimate and legally binding contract, which must have the implicit consent of all parties involved, and constitutions. And, you know, another standard argument is against those that don't wish to be bound by a document they don't agree with is, well, why don't you just move, you know, move to Somalia or something. But if you believe in private property, if you believe in free association, you know, why should I, a property owning American, have to forego my rights, you know, to property, and in my own person have to move, right? Certainly those that support secession must agree, and I'm sure that many of the members of the live audience would support states' rights in terms of nullification and secession. But if you support secession, you must be logically consistent. Not only do states and municipalities have the right to opt out of their government, but individuals do as well, right? Because how can you delegate a right to an exterior body you yourself don't have? So, you know, and this goes back to the non-aggression principle. It's illegitimate. It's unjust to conscript individuals into a system they may not wish to be a part of. You know, just because they were born inside the boundaries of some territorial political monopoly. But, you know, imagine going to a court in the private sector in order to pursue legal action against someone for violating an agreement they didn't even sign to. You know, the judge would laugh in your face. But, you know, and one argument I've made before is, you know, that constitutional limited government depends on the sustained vigilance of the population to function correctly. And private contracts require little increased vigilance or knowledge on part of the citizenry, as acting man who consistently pursues his own rational self-interest maintains a higher level of vigilance in his own private sphere than in the public or political space. An example I often give is to illustrate this is like think about the last time McDonald's made your cheeseburger wrong, right? Did you go home? Did you make a YouTube video about it? Well, maybe. Did you angrily demand, or did you angrily demand that they make it right and get what you paid for, right? And undoubtedly, McDonald's, who wishes to keep your business, remade your burger, you know, even if they weren't nice about it. But compare this to the political realm. You know, what did you do when the NSA made your surveillance wrong, or when the U.S. military made your defense wrong, right? Did you feel like you had the power to demand remuneration? Did you demand redress? Did you march right up to the Capitol or to the government offices and tell them, make my burger right, damn you? Did you write your congressman? Did you make calls? Did you launch protests? Did you file lawsuits?
Even if you did any of it matter?
Exactly.
I mean, it's actually like accepted legal doctrine that the state has no obligation towards you. Like, for example, the police, they have no obligation to protect you as an individual. They just have according to the Supreme Court, they have an obligation to like protect society, whatever that means. But that doesn't mean you individually. And the only time they are obligated to protect you individually is, ironically, when you're like a criminal, and you're in their jurisdiction or whatever. But yeah, there's a lot to be said about the social contract thing. So
And
I mean, most people who just throw these words around haven't really read the arguments, right? But there are two arguments that have been made for it. One of which is that at one point, like at the beginning of this, like we all held hands, and we were like, okay, so we're gonna give this thing the power, whatever. Which is, I mean, it's stupid, right? That didn't happen. So we can just dismiss that. But then there's the implicit consent thing, which is because you haven't left, you're implicitly consenting. But now there's such a thing as implicit consent, right? So if you have a party, right, and you say, hey guys, after the party, if you stay here, you all have to clean up and stuff. And if you stay, then that's implicit consent, right? Because you were there. But you were never asked to join the party of the state, so to speak. You were just burned there. And another thing to be said about this is that explicit dissent has more weight than implicit consent, right? So let's say again, we're in this party, and I say, well, you stayed here because you implicitly consented. If you say, actually, I don't agree, then you can say, okay, then you can, okay, fine, because explicit dissent trumps implicit consent, and there's something that doesn't apply with the state. We are all explicitly dissenting, and it's not being recognized because it's not convenient for the state that explicit dissent trumps implicit consent. And okay, so another thing is calling the Constitution a contract, right? So none of us were alive there when it was signed, so neither of us signed it. So one of the requirements of contract is both parties have to agree, right? So we didn't agree. So in that sense, it's invalid. Another requirement of contracts is that there's a reasonable way of opting out, and to opt out of the contract of the Constitution, you have to literally leave, literally move physically with all your stuff, and they charge you money, and they have to accept you leaving because they have to issue your passport. So that's not a reasonable way of opting out. Another requirement for a contract is mutual and conditional obligation, right? And like I had just said, the government doesn't recognize any obligation towards you. So it lacks any of the requirements for a legitimate contract. And this is a legitimate contract according to common law, which is what you have in what's the name? In case law in the United States. So even according to their own rules, they have a legitimate contract, right? So the state, you might say, oh, okay, whatever, but it's practical to accept the Constitution and so on. Okay, maybe. But as far as legitimacy goes, it has zero. It's very, very hard to make the case that there's any legitimate obligation to the state. It's impossible, basically.
Yeah, and another condition to create an implicit contract is the fact that it has to be made on equal footing, right? So take the social contract. It's unilateral, right? So it's state to citizen, you must pay taxes, you must do this, etc. You must attend jury duty, whatever. But the same implicit contract could not be made citizen to citizen or citizen to state. You couldn't write a document and implicitly contract someone to pay you taxes. You can implicitly contract someone to give you their time or their labor. So yeah, it's not on equal footing, therefore it's an invalid contract. And one final thing, the fact that, minarchists, if the Constitution, it's either authorized this massive government or it's been powerless to stop it. I'm not sure if you've made this argument yet, but I'll make it now. There's a quote from Lysander Spooner, and it's the Constitution has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist.
Yeah. So the experiment has been run, right? And these are the results. And So it failed. Very, very obviously.
Well, yeah, and don't take my position wrong. Some of you view in the external. I think it's at least good that we have this Constitution to point to, as Tom Woods calls it, as a bludgeon, to point out that the government don't even follow their own rules. But the point I was trying to make when I was speaking earlier was, individuals have much more influence in their own private lives and have, a personal, innate preoccupation with preserving their interests when interacting with, other citizens, businesses, that requires little increased education. That don't require any political awareness. It's just something you do when you act in your self-interest. But that, that's not to say that some level of vigilance is not required to enforce private contracts. The point, however, is that there exists, like I said, much more incentive to enforce mutual obligations in one's own personal associations. So the majority of people are not likely to seek redress, the majority of people are more likely to seek redress, like against their homeowner or their home builder, for example, for like building a shabby foundation that collapses, than they are against their own government for violating their home or property, and are much more likely, to see actual redress. So, individuals are, like I said, more likely to gain redress in their private sphere, especially when contracts contain clear property descriptions and stipulate what's to be done if the home builder fails to fulfill his obligations to you. So it's in one's own immediate and tangible self-interest to ensure these safeguards in their private and personal life. And like I said, the Constitution contains no such descriptions, and instead is more or less just a sweeping judgment that neglects individual preference and unique circumstance. So, like in a private law society where contracts contain these clear property definitions and means of redress, mutually agreed upon independent outside arbitrators are going to be much more impartial than the state apparatus otherwise would. So, and this is the big problem with the constitutional system. Who determines what is constitutional? It's the fucking government, right? As I spit backer all over my computer screen. Yeah, it's the government. So go back to McDonald's, right? Imagine receiving food poisoning from McDonald's. Would you feel comfortable having your case heard by a court owned and operated by McDonald's? Obviously not, right? So why do you expect Supreme Court judges, either politically appointed or otherwise, to maintain some sort of allegiance to a document that limits the power of the very same institution on which their career depends, as Adam was saying? So, and we see this over and over again. And, like I said, while there's some small constitutional wins here and there, the separation of powers envisioned by our founders, it's completely non-existent. And, if you look at things, what is it? Footnote, what's the footnote? Footnote 4, is that what it's called? Footnote 4. So in a Supreme Court case here in the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that, or ruled at one point, that everything the government does is de facto considered to be constitutional. Right? That's what's happened. You've got the very same institution under consideration deciding whether or not what it does is right or not. So, that's one of the most glaring problems with a constitutional form of limited government. And also, it's important to consider that the Constitution represented an increase in the growth of government in the United States, and was left intentionally vague, in my view, especially surrounding things like government regulation of economic activities. And by example, or by comparison, like I think the Articles of Confederation took like 5 years of deliberation, and the Constitution was more or less pushed through only after like 3 months or something. The Constitution was a usurpation of liberty over the system that existed prior, and was more or less an elitist document signed for the most part by English aristocrats for the admitted purpose of gaining control over the national territory and dividing the populace. I've got a quote from James Madison here, who is widely considered the father of the Constitution, though that claim is debatable. But he openly admitted this during the debate on the Constitution. Madison said the following: So where a majority are united by a common sentiment and have an opportunity, the rights of the minor party become insecure. In a Republican government, the majority, if united, always has an opportunity. The only remedy, then, is to enlarge the sphere and thereby divide the community into so great a number of interests and parties that, in the first place, a majority will not be likely at the same moment to have a common interest separate from that of the whole or of the minority. And in the second place, that in case they should have an interest, they may not be apt so to unite in the pursuit of it. So you've got Madison basically during the constitutional debates outlining divide and conquer strategies, saying that when we get this large centralized state under the Constitution, we can rule these fuckers like dupes. You know, they'll never be able to unite against us. And, you know, this is certainly backed up by, I need to spit this fucking backer out, backed up by notable historians, even that are, you know, more lefty oriented. I think it was Dr. Forrest McDonald, or he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's considered one of the most foremost authorities on the Constitution in the earlier national period. But, you know, he described the founding as more or less a device to set up a set of true falsehoods about origins, you know, a mythology that would make it desirable for nationals to continue to live under common authority and make it impossible for them to entertain contrary thoughts. So we get all this stuff about Betsy Ross sewing the flag, which never fucking happened. There's no historical precedent or evidence that ever occurred. Paul Revere, that never fucking happened. These are a mythos. These are lies. It's bullshit, right? These were English aristocrats that created a large central state for the express purpose of dominating you, right? The Constitution wasn't written with the intention of creating a free society, but to create an ever-expanding federal government at the expense of individual rights and state prerogatives, right?
Yeah, they definitely went stupid. They knew what they were doing.
Well, somebody talk while I spit this backer out.
Yeah, I mean, we've pretty much covered a lot. Go on.
No, I don't know. It was a pretty impassioned speech there to back her up. I tend to agree. I mean, and there's just a lot of reasons why it would be in pretty much everybody's best interest to get rid of the state. But like I've said before, there's a lot of propaganda machine working in the opposite direction to tell people that they need the state and give people. I mean, look at Greece right now and the people of Greece. Like, despite everything that's happened over there and how bad their government has fucked everything up for them, who are they begging to fix all their problems? You know,
Socialists.
Socialists, yeah.
Yeah.
And and government in general, and it's
even the anarchists. They're left anarchists.
Especially.
All of them.
Yeah.
There's massive riots with left anarchists. It's like they're the opposite of the government, but they still take in all the propaganda.
Well, I mean, the social welfare programs are like a drug for a lot of these people. Like, they can't function without it.
Yeah.
It's a bad addiction, and you know, when you try and take a bad addiction away from a lot of people, if it's a bad enough addiction, they're going to lash out and not think rationally and not really analyze, like, what did I do to get myself here, and how can I get out of here in the best way possible? They're like, just give me more fucking drugs, asshole. You know, and eventually you run out of drugs.
Exactly like a drug, like every trait of a drug. It's the same for social welfare. I mean, it makes you more dependent on it the more you use it. You know, the effectiveness of it decreases over time. Yeah, it's every trait imaginable. You may as well just call it a drug.
I mean, it exhibits the classic symptoms of addiction, as defined by like Freud and them.
Mm.
I'm pretty sure on the checklist it's like 13 out of 14 or something like that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Statism is a drug. So to get back to some more points about the Constitution, because I know it's hard, guys. It's hard to let go of. I mean, there's no doubt that the American system was the most free and the best system, arguably, that's ever existed, right? That provided the most liberty for the most people, the most upward mobility, because government was kept so small. But it's important to consider that this document was never put before the people. The Constitution was never put before the people for ratification. And if you look at the news articles and shit from the time, it was openly opposed by the majority of people.
Well, it was like speaking from my New Englander heritage. One thing we're taught very strongly is it was strong-armed into be. Rhode Island absolutely was not going to ratify it, and the only reason that they did is because they were actually blockaded from trade with anyone else, and they were completely surrounded by other states who had already. Massachusetts had signed it, I think Connecticut had signed it, and so they were in the middle there. And though they held out and they were like, we're not going to sign this because, well, their reasoning was they wanted a Bill of Rights, but regardless, they had opposition to it, and they just put ships around the entire coastline of Rhode Island, and if you tried to go in or out for trade, they'd shoot you down. And so that's how the Constitution became ratified. They were the last state to vote to ratify it, and they said all 13 had to agree or they wouldn't ratify it. And it was gotten to by literally thugging them, extorting them.
Yeah, and I think it portrays the sentiment of of the signers, that the fact that their names were kept secret for an entire generation after the Constitution was signed for fear of reprisal. I mean, that should tell you something right there. But to speak a little bit more about the Constitution's ratification, it was ratified behind closed doors, right? With only like 39 of the total 74 delegates signing the document. And there's a good book. He's not particularly an intellectual of the movement, but I would recommend this book. It's by K.W. Royce, and it's called Hologram of Liberty. But he says a bit of math is illuminating here. And here's a quote from his book. So the states chose 74 delegates, 19 of whom refused to attend. Of the 55 that showed up on May 14th, 14 left early, leaving 41. Of the 41 that stayed through September 3rd, 3 refused to sign. So only 34 of the chosen 74 delegates signed the Constitution during the convention. That's 53%. So of the original 74, nearly half refused to attend, quit, or didn't sign. And as you were saying, after the convention, an additional 5 more delegates did sign, with delegates from Rhode Island holding out the longest, 2 years. But when asked why he boycotted the convention, Patrick Henry famously said, "Because I smelled a rat." And you mentioned the Bill of Rights. We have anti-constitutionalists to thank for the Bill of Rights. It was the anti-federalists that wanted the Bill of Rights, right? So, and obviously they were opponents to ratification because they feared that it would create an overbearing central government, and that this is exactly what's happened. And
well, it happened in those days. Are you familiar with Shays' Rebellion?
Oh yeah.
Obviously, again, being from the area that I'm from, I'm familiar with a lot of the history. And the Shays' Rebellion, to me, is interesting because you look at the rhetoric from Samuel Adams, that he was very critical of government and federal systems. But when Shays' Rebellion happened, the first thing he did is use his power to, literally send troops out to kill these guys who, at the time, were just blockading courtroom doors. They hadn't engaged in violence until they were aggressed upon. That's one. And then the other thing he did is he called out literally to Washington and said, "Hey, man, I need the federal forces to come down here and stop these guys because they don't want to be incarcerated for a war debt that's inflated and not really fair to them. And my banker friends want me to put these guys in prison, and they're not having it, and they're standing outside the courtroom with guns. So we need the force of the federal government to come and shut these guys up, completely ignoring the preceding 10 years of propaganda that Samuel Adams had put out. In my mind, he's one of history's biggest hypocrites. Another good case could be the Whiskey Rebellion as well, but the Shays Rebellion strikes me because a lot of the guys who were championing freedom and personal liberties and states' rights were the guys involved with shutting down Shays Rebellion and not allowing them to redress their grievances or anything like that.
That's interesting. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, and it's almost I can't think of the word, but it's very prevalent in the liberty movement now to mention the Whiskey Rebellion and stuff. What are the first act of the new government? That had just fought taxes and shit from the British. Well, they're going to ride down their own fucking countrymen over a whiskey.
Yeah.
So, but I think the Anti-Federalists really deserve a lot more recognition than they get, because they foresaw all this shit, and they explicitly said all this stuff, and but some of the things that they were particularly concerned about was like the Commerce Clause, which would later be termed the Everything Clause, used by centralizers to justify almost every conceivable federal intervention in the private economy.
Actually, that's a good footnote that Given Isosceles pointed out, I forgot to mention. So because of Shays' Rebellion is why they pushed so hard to get the Constitution passed. They used it as an example of you need a federal government, you need a federalist system, because these farmers are just going to get guns and come run your courtrooms down or whatever. And so they really did push it on the back of Shays' Rebellion. I think that's why it's a footnote in history to a lot of people, because it came before the Whiskey Rebellion and before the Constitution, and it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. But these men were, the fighters in the Revolution for the most part, and farmers, and they were given these insane, overly inflated loans to produce food for the war effort, and then we're told that they couldn't pay back the loans at this insane interest. I think it was a 200% interest rate or something like that. And then they were put into debtors' prisons. And it's why wouldn't somebody pick up some rifles and go and blockade the court? They essentially were just shutting down the court. The judge can't come in, the jury can't come in. And that's why Samuel Adams and George Washington, used it to push to the Constitutional Convention. Well, you need to prevent this kind of thing. I look at it as one of the first American peaceful protests, honestly.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked into Shays' Rebellion, but I am familiar with it. But yeah, I think it's important to point out some of the things that are particularly nefarious in the Constitution that the Anti-Federalists were on top of from the very beginning. And these are men who opposed the Constitution on the grounds that its checks on federal power would be undetermined, by expansive interpretations of promoting the general welfare, which is literally claimed for every law now, the common good, or, and the, what's it called, the all laws necessary and proper clause, right, which was would be used to override limits on delegated federal powers, creating unwarranted, undelegated powers that were bound to be abused. So the Commerce Clause refers to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, quote. So Jefferson argued that because fundamentally, sub specie aeternitatis, everything affects everything else, right? So the Commerce Clause would essentially lead to an unlimited government. And when commenting on the Commerce Clause before ratification, I believe it was Madison that claimed the clause was not intended to give the federal government a positive power, right? But instead it affirmed a negative power to strike things down that inhibit the freedom of commerce. For example, like tariffs that states might impose on one another. But you know, since then, its interpretation has been expanded immensely. But to illustrate how broad the interpretation has become, this is an example Tom Woods likes to point out, and others, was the Supreme Court case Wickard versus Filburn. So a farmer, Roscoe Filburn, was growing wheat for on-farm consumption in Ohio, and the U.S. government had established limits on wheat production based on acreage owned by farmers in order to drive up wheat prices during the Great Depression. And so Filburn was growing more than those limits permitted, and so he was ordered to pay a fine, even though he was producing the excess wheat for his own use and had no intention of selling it. So the Supreme Court decided that Filburn's wheat growing activities, this is the what they said to, you know, to I'm having trouble finding words tonight. This was the rationale, the court's rationale for ruling how they did. But they said that Filburn's growing activities reduced the amount of wheat he would buy for chicken and feed on the open market, which is traded internationally, thus affecting interstate commerce. So because you're growing shit on your own shit, you're not going to be buying other shit. So we can regulate you under the Commerce Clause because of this. And, you know, although this guy had a relatively small amount of production of more wheat than he was allotted, and it obviously wouldn't affect interstate commerce, you know, at all, really. You know, the culminative actions of thousands of farmers, the court said, like Filburn, would certainly become more substantial. And so, therefore, according to the court, Filburn's production of food for his own family on his own property could be regulated by the federal government. And so, you know, the interpretation problem is one of many. The sole arbitration problem is the other huge problem. You know, the Constitutions provide an important legal framework, right, with which to defend against tyranny with the federal government. Like I said, it's at least we have this Constitution to point to within the current political paradigm. But you know, it's certainly we have it now than we didn't. But to reiterate, you know, because of the inherent nature of the system, the government itself determining for itself whether or not what it does is constitutional, the innate ambiguity of the document, right, that ensured the quick usurpation and misinterpretation of its important precedents, you know, along with that lack of personal incentive that exists for private citizens to engage in public affairs, it makes Constitution just an inadequate device for maintaining economic and personal liberty, and, you know, reining in the tyranny of the state in the 21st century.
That's some seriously communist bullshit for wheat story. But honestly, that sounds like something you'd hear from North Korea.
Yeah, but that's the unintended consequences of the state, right? That's, you know, people always ignore that when you make anything, like in logic, if you do something, there is going to be consequences, whether or not you can predict them, you know, and whether or not they're the intended outcome. I mean, it's physics, right? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Well, they're not always opposite, but there's always some type of consequential thing. You're setting events in motion, and of course something's going to come of it. And, you know, it just seems that the majority of the time the unintended consequences hurt, especially not the wealthy and, you know, well-to-do and the power elites. They hurt the working class. They hurt the average people. But that's how it's designed.
And it's important to note that North Korea actually has a constitution. Let me read it to you. You'll laugh at some of this. Okay. Okay, so it says on the economy. Oh no, wait, hang on. Sorry. Fundamental rights and duties of citizens. Citizens have freedom of religious beliefs, but they ban people for reading the Bible. They have freedom of residence and travel, even though they have allotted apartments. Citizens shall constantly increase their revolutionary vigilance. Oh, you've got to read some of this shit, man. I'll put it in the chat. Yeah, so constitutions, you know, they're not the best idea.
But yeah, well, we are coming up on the 2-hour mark as I sweat profusely, and I guess we'll go ahead and give our outros, plug anything you want to plug, let people know where to find you, and then we will end the live feed. So go ahead, Adam.
Hi, you guys should look up The Problem of Political Authority by Michael Huemer. Just look it up on YouTube or whatever. You'll find something good by him. And yeah, bye.
Thanks. Justin?
Yeah, you can find me 420 Homestead on YouTube, putting out weekly videos, getting back into it now. And actually, the last video I made, I referenced that Supreme Court case that you were just talking about a little while ago, where the farmer was not allowed to grow wheat for his chickens. You know, because that's something that could potentially affect me directly. I don't know. I haven't heard about the government using the Commerce Clause to shut down backyard gardens recently, but it's definitely something they could do if they chose to.
Sweet. Max?
Yeah, I would recommend if people want to get an insight into what I think, look up Christopher Cantwell's articles, "A Culture of Resistance and Violently Overthrow the Government," and then call the NSA and tell them you're not a bad guy.
Tom?
You can find me on Emancipated Human on Facebook. I admin for the page. My admin tag is CC.
Sweet. And I'm Asa J. You can find my work on policeStateDaily.com. If damned HostGator would ever get their shit together and get my service fixed. And on copblock.org. And you can find some of us as well on the Libertarian Brutalism Network YouTube channel. So I was looking out in the chat, and it was posted in here. One of the chats I really like to participate in actually has started a Sunday show as well. So we might be changing the day. We may change to Saturdays in an attempt to draw some more of those guys over here, and to also give us an opportunity to attend those chats as well, which I always find enjoyable. The Informed State of Mind platform that Luke Banner runs is really a really great platform, something I would definitely recommend. But yeah, I guess that about does it, and we'll keep you posted on if we decide to change the night. And thank you for joining us. I will pop on out to the chat and give some final shout outs. I really appreciate you guys for attending. We had Max out there. Pippy Glockencake. Oh, I didn't see you earlier, Pip. Damn, I would have linked you up if you would have liked to have joined, if you're still there. But maybe next week. We've got the Ranting Hick, Adam out there causing chaos. Let's see, we had KK in here earlier under 2 accounts, making friends. Let's see who else. My homeboy Giving Isosceles. What do you say, man? Glad you could join us. Sparkles LaRue. We had Dystopian Empire. Hey, what's up, dude? If you'd like to join next week, let us know, man. I'll be sure to shoot you a link. My homeboy Don. What's up, man? Politically Incorrect. Got Justin out there as well. And yeah, if Don wasn't here for the first part of the show, yeah, part of what we're trying to do here is to cultivate a platform for people with some of the more unpopular opinions. So on the last Sunday or Saturday now of each month, we're going to do these open panels, and I definitely want like the Ranting Hick and Don and you know, Smurf Killer and others like that. Not that Smurf has unpopular opinions, but he's just a really smart dude, and I'd like to see him participate. But yeah, so keep a lookout for that, and I'll be sure to link you up, and we'll talk about some stuff, man, and some things. But yeah, that about does it, guys. Thanks. We'll see you next week.